So you wrote, is mental illness contagion? And the reason I was so taken by it is because I've watched firsthand contagion happening on my psych unit. For example, somebody starts hitting the wall with their fist, and guess what? They're all doing it within, no kidding, 2 days. So can you talk to me then about what contagion is and how it happened in 3 minutes or less?
Sure. So contagion, from a psychological perspective, is the idea that a symptom appears in a group or society. What causes the contagion to suddenly spread is basically a kind of publicization of that idea. So I'll give you a few examples. So in Hong Kong, in Asia, in the 1970s and 60s and 50s, there was no such thing as anorexia. There were people who refused food, but it was not diagnosed as anorexia in the way that we understand it in the West. Mm-hmm. And then one day, a schoolgirl was walking home one day from school in a school uniform, and she was being watched by a shopkeeper on the street. And she was standing at a corner, and a bus went past, and then the girl just dropped down dead. And it caused this huge kind of scandal in Hong Kong at the time. How could a girl drop dead in the middle of the street? What had happened? The doctor sort of looked at her and saw that she'd been malnourished. But what the pathologist at the time was a English pathologist. He'd been trained in England, and so he was arrested because that was when Hong Kong was still a colony. And he said, "I know what this is. This is what we call anorexia nervosa," which was by that point was only a Western idea that had been documented in America and parts of Western Europe. And then what happened is the press started talking about anorexia nervosa, and they started looking for experts in it and talking about it. And then something strange happened. The rates of anorexia had gone from what were recorded were maybe like 10 cases a year for 20 years before then, to thousands upon thousands upon thousands.
That's shocking. I was shocked. That was just absolutely unbelievable to me, seeing the stats you wrote about that.
And you see it everywhere, right? And so another example was bulimia, right? Another eating disorder. Rates of bulimia in England in 1980s were marginal. They didn't take up a lot of space in academic journals. It was a kind of a bit of a fringe discussion. It was considered a kind of adjacent to anorexia. And then Princess Diana came along. And the media had worked itself into a frenzy about her having an eating disorder. She denied it. And then what happened is then she finally, in an interview on TV, she admitted that she had bulimia. And then cases of bulimia skyrocketed in British society. But then what happened is when Diana died, rates of bulimia started to go down.
I know. Yeah. But how then, by talking about it, do we avoid the contagion in terms of more people doing it?
If I said to you, we spoke at the beginning of the call, and you said, "Hi Matt, how are you?" And I just talked gibberish at you, complete incoherent babble, and you went, "I have no idea what that means. I don't feel like you've understood how I feel."
Right.
But if I use things like "I'm anxious" or "a bit depressed today," you immediately know how I feel, or have an understanding of how I might feel. So inside all of this contagion is a desire to be understood. And so we look at the example of anorexia and look at the example of bulimia in England. Inside that is an idea of there were lots of people who were suffering from emotional distress but did not have the language to describe it, or the language that brought with it a kind of easy way for other people to understand what was happening to them.
Okay.
So at the heart of it is a drive to be understood. But then the flip side of that is, in our need to be understood, what can happen is then people can then add their own interpretations of what we think we're telling them.
Right.
So if I said to you, "I'm depressed," and I said to you, "I'm taking antidepressants," you might have a judgment on that. You might think that, he's a bit odd, or I wouldn't trust him around my kids or whatever, right? You might bring your own judgment into it. And so what happens is these words become contested, and these words start to become very fluid. And what you see, I wrote about recently, the psychopaths of TikTok. So these were typically young women who had diagnosis of antisocial behavior disorders, right? Which has become the kind of, they use the byword of psychopath because it's more alluring and it attracts more attention. They have used it to monetize their condition. And they've used it to speak to other young girls about what it feels like to be a psychopath, to have no empathy, to that sort of thing. And so these words become very fluid, and it becomes then a point of who gets to own the word, who gets to protect its meaning, and who gets to protect how you should respond to it. And so I think, how do we stop it? I think that how do we stop it is by maybe not trying to apply the brakes so often. Because if you have a child that comes to you in school and they've seen this girl on TikTok and they say to you, I think I might be a psychopath, what would your response be? Would you other them? Would you push them away? Would you go, I need to escalate this because a child has told me, because my understanding of a psychopath is perhaps from movies or perhaps from kind of like old 1960s, 70s psychologically diagnosis. And so I think that the challenge we have as people who in the teaching profession or in the mental health profession is when these words are sort of released into the wild, as they have been, they take on a mind of their own and they take on the owners that embody them. And so when they come back to us in these different forms, and working in mental health, we chuck out words all the time. Like if you look on the internet, you're either a narcissist or you're what's the word? Basically, just derivatives of the idea of you being an arsehole, essentially. When we use medical words and we throw them at other people, what we're really doing is using the kind of authority of medicine or mental health to denigrate and lessen the experiences of somebody else. And so that's why I come back to this idea of these words are contested, is because whoever uses them and applies them to themselves or to denigrate somebody else changes its meaning. So if I say I'm depressed, it might be because I want to be understood. If you tell me that I think you're depressed, you might be sort of trying to other me or change the hierarchy and the dynamic of power here. So my answer to the question is you can't control it because we live in a time where language can accelerate out of psych wards and mental health therapy rooms into the wider internet at such a pace that we lose ownership of them very quickly.
Could we lessen it? Like what I'm hearing you say is if we hold on to language and maybe not normalize it. Like there's a difference of destigmatizing and normalizing. And as soon as we normalize something, there's your contagion too.
Exactly.
Right.
And so when I have clients come to me with all kinds of like very, very articulate mental health diagnosis, they come to me and say, I am an anxious avoidant attachment style. I want to move to a secure form of attachment style. And what I do with my clients is I say, okay, I want you to tell me what it feels like to be you and not use those words. I want you just to use just the language that you use every day. I want you to tell me what it's like, but don't rely on that language.
Right.
And what you find is a completely different story. And so I think these words that were designed to be helpful, this sort of shorthand for understanding, I think if we push past them and go, so if a child comes to you and says that I'm really anxious or I'm depressed or I think I'm a psychopath, asking them to tell you what it feels like to be them without using those words often reveals far more.
Right. As we conclude here, can you give me, like in a sentence, what is that fine balance between us destigmatizing and not creating conditions for contagion?
I think the balance is that we must always come from a position of what is this person trying to communicate to me about what it feels like to be them.
Okay. And then receive it as that and be able to work with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Number 2 is if there's one thing you could do to change how we are talking about mental health disorders, what would it be to remove the contagion effect?
It would be to remove the idea that you are broken if you suffer.
Good. Totally. Yeah. Good. Okay. You and I talked a lot before about connection.
Yeah.
What would connection between human beings, if we could grow that more versus rely on pills, what would that do to potentially slow down contagion if we were connected?
I think it would not only slow contagion down, I think it would do a lot to sort of repair a lot of the social contract that we live in at the moment. We live in a really volatile time, and I think that the reason my understanding of the reason why life has become so volatile is because we've let something come in between people.
Yeah.
And that's technology.
Yeah.
Because if you think about what we really see now in the world is I'm very angry, and then the internet or an algorithm goes, here's someone else who's really angry too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I'm going to do is push you together and you're going to shout at each other. Because that is popular in the algorithm's eyes, right? The yardstick that it measures engagement. If me and you shout at each other on the internet, the algorithm goes, I've done my job, I've created engagement. Take that algorithm out of that picture and go, tell me what it's like to be you, and I'll tell you what it's like to be me. And what you find is connection, when you clear out all the middlemen who are trying to monetize your feelings, what you find is I think the world will be a far better place.
Yeah, that is good. I like that.